Yeah, hello everybody. I was very delighted I was able to hear the panel group, the group discussion of the various tables. Now I've worked with Lao PDR, Timor-Leste, Cambodia, Philippines, and Indonesia over the last 25 years. So it's really interesting for me to hear how you're dealing with this climate change issues and how you're trying to integrate it into the work that you're doing in the ministries of finance. So what I'm going to do now is I'll do a presentation about possible entry points for work on climate change when you're sitting in the Ministry of Finance. A little bit of it is this was motivated by the fact that many countries are going into climate budget tagging at this particular point in time. I worked early on with Philippines on this back, over a decade ago when they started work on this, and it's really taken off worldwide. I mean, everywhere I go in Latin America, in Europe, in all over Asia, people are talking about how they integrate climate change into the budget, and budget tagging is the tool that everybody's really trying to go to as probably the first entry point. But there are many other entry points that one might need to consider, and the sort of tools that you might consider as probably being more foundational, that'll help you set the direction. There was an interesting discussion I heard from my colleagues in Timor-Leste about planning, the importance of planning, for instance. And I think it's important to sort of build onto that, think a little bit about, what are the various entry points that one might consider. Every country is different. Every country has different institutional configuration. Everybody has different kinds of policies that they're trying to implement. And there's no one size fits all. So some tools will fit some countries and some tools will fit others. And, I think it's very important that everybody thinks about what's going to work best for them. So I'll start off with, let me see if this thing's going to work around. Some of what we're trying to achieve here, when we're talking about climate change governance, is about trying to put in place institutions that create incentives and enable those public institutions to actually implement climate action. When we're working with ministries of finance, I think it's very easy to get a bit of a blinded and by thinking about the public sector as being the key driver for work on climate change. And I don't think that's really true. The public sector, apart from where there's state-owned enterprises, is not a major contributor to emissions, and it is not a major area of risk in terms of adaptation. The key actors are businesses and households. And what we're trying to do in the public sector is create the right incentives for them and enable the households and businesses to adapt and to decarbonize. And the key tools we have for those are regulation, information first. Everybody needs to understand what the context of climate change is, and the public sector is probably best in place to educate people about climate change and its implications. We have regulation. We're able to regulate markets and guide them towards new technologies. We can use taxation, really powerful tool to change prices, which is critical for climate policy, particularly in terms of decarbonization. And public spending is really our last resort. I know we're all ministries of finance people and we're talking about PEMNA, but in the end, the public spending is really the last thing we should be going to when we're trying to implement climate policies. When we are thinking about the role of ministries of finance, it's important that we think about some essential foundations. And I'll keep on talking about these as the presentation goes along. You need to have a good understanding of what the risks are. Now, those are both the risks, the physical risks from climate extreme events and long-term climate change, and also the risks that happen in the transition. Now, in most of your countries, the big issue for you in terms of transition risks is going to be how to maintain competitiveness in a world where technologies are changing and markets are changing as they decarbonize. So those risks need to be very much central in the way that you're thinking about what the environment you're operating in is going to be for the future. You need to have a long-term strategy, and it needs to be cross multiple government mandates. We're talking about huge structural changes in the economy as we decarbonize, and as climate change has impacts on the viability of various agricultural activities. And so I think we need to think about that in terms of long-term change of how we manage it. think how the world has changed over the last 40 years with the digital revolution. We're thinking about similar huge structural changes over the next 30 years as well. Also, when we think about the basic tools that we're basically using most of the time our public investment management and our public financial management systems to drive our policy when we think about public spending. And if those systems aren't strong, if they don't have the right tools in place, the basic tools in place, if you don't have an appraisal system, for instance, or you don't have a program structure to your budget, it's going to be very difficult to use those tools to support your climate policy. I can't stress enough the need for a long-term vision and a multi-year commitment. That's, these big changes need to be thought through over the longer term. I realize that's very difficult for ministries of finance. We tend to focus very much on the year, but you really don't do much in a year, particularly when you think about long-term change. So the ministries of finance do need to be involved in that long-term planning process. And again, I heard from our colleagues in Timor-Leste about how those functions may be in different ministries. Well, it's important for ministries of finance to see how they can engage in that process. Last point on this slide is really that, we don't know what works best. We've seen, and I think we've learned from experience a lot of the time, but I think all of the countries around the world are going to need to experiment and adapt. Look what everybody else is doing, which is why events like this PEMNA event are so important. See what works for you and make those adjustments. And a lot of the changes we can do are at a technical level, and you don't really need the political leadership to take the lead, make big statements. We can make small adjustments to what we're doing and think about how to include climate change in our work at a technical level before we go big with major structural changes. So can I just check in? Is everybody getting a change to the slides? Are you seeing a planning slide now?
Yes, Adrian.
That's good. Okay, great. So the main tool that everybody needs to have in place is a plan. If you don't have a plan for climate change, you are basically working without maps, without a compass, and your direct sense of direction is not going to be clear. You need to have long-term plans that sort of define the policy goals. What are you trying to achieve in the world of climate change? What's the role of the state? The role of the state is very different in Laos than it is in Timor or Cambodia or Philippines or Indonesia. You all have very different political economy systems. So you need to think, well, in the context of the way that your state operates, what's the role that we have and what's the role of the private sector? And then you need to think a little bit about how do we align what we're trying to achieve with the resource constraints we face, and what do we do to actually guide those institutions within the state that actually deliver services, deliver infrastructure? How do we guide them into taking climate action? The very basis of any kind of plan is a good risk assessment. You need to have a sense of, what are the short-term risks that you're facing? What are the long-term risks that you're facing? And what are in terms of the physical and the transition risks to your economy? Without the basic risk assessment, it's very difficult to plan. I think a lot the UNFCCC encourages all countries to take a risk assessment, a risk and vulnerability assessment. They shouldn't just focus on adaptation needs. It should really also cover, what's going to happen in the global economy? How's this going to impact us? And then what does that mean for ministries of finance? What does that mean about how our resource allocations have to change? How our revenue streams are going to change over the future, and sort of build that sort of risk assessment into the way that you're thinking about the problems you're trying to address. The fundamental tool of all climate policy work needs to be a long-term strategy. The UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, I think it's Article 418, encourages countries to put in place what they call a long-term strategy. I checked, and half of the countries that are in the PEMNA meeting today have a long-term strategy. Half of them don't have a long-term strategy. I do think that having this long-term strategy is a sort of fundamental building block because it sort of sets the direction you're going to go. a lot of the long-term strategies will probably need to be adapted and improved as you go along. They should at least set the goal. You know, what's the goal for the country for 2050? What's the goal for the country 2030? I heard as you were doing your presentations, a lot of you have already defined those goals, which is fantastic. Then you need to think, okay, well, what's the role of the state within this to achieve these goals? And what's the role of the private sector? What's the role of local government? What's the role of communities? Sort of setting the scene of who's doing what. And then think about what are policy instruments? What are the best tools that we need to actually deliver this? You know, when do we use information? When do we just tell people what's going to happen? Tell people about new technologies? When do we regulate the market? When do we say, well, you can no longer use fossil fuels for vehicles? Or when do we provide tax incentives for people to switch to electrified transport? And then, where are we going to use the limited amount of public money that we have and so many competing demands? Where are we going to use that very limited amount of public spending to support our policies and create the right incentive environment? Once you have your long-term strategy, then you need to think a little bit about, well, you know, long-term strategies are great in setting the direction, but they don't tell you what to do tomorrow. They don't tell you what to do in the next budget cycle. So I think you need to break those long-term strategies down into planning instruments that suit with your short-term planning cycles, your medium-term planning cycles, and embed them in your various institutions. So, you know, you need the development plans, you need territorial plans, you need sector plans. Planning, I can't stress enough the importance of long-term planning for every institution in the state so it knows where it's going and what it's supposed to be doing. Measurement and reporting and verification. I heard several of you mention the difficulties you have in gathering information about what's happening on climate change. That's very important. The UNFCCC framework requires every state to produce measurement, have a measurement, reporting and verification process in. Ministries of finance, governments are not required to report on financing. It's not a requirement. But it is important that you actually gather information on what's happening in the real economy and what the roles of the various institutions are, clarify what the roles of the various institutions are in gathering the information you need to create a feedback loop for your planning. A lot of countries are now thinking about financing strategies. You know, climate change is going to generate a lot. There will be a lot of international finance for climate change, both on the private sector and on the public sector through multilateral institutions. It's a very complicated environment, very complicated. Many different actors, many different tools. A lot of you are talking about green bonds. That's sovereign green bonds are certainly one important source of funding, but they're only one of many. And I think having a structure in place where you're thinking about what your financing strategy is going to be is very helpful. And I've beginning to see some countries are actually setting up dedicated units in the Ministry of Finance whose job it is just to understand what the different private and public sources of finance are and maximize the amount of resources that each country is able to mobilize through those channels. Public investment management. You know, I jump into public investment management before I talk about budgeting, because I think public investment management is about managing the future a more distant future, much more than it is than budgeting is. Now, I'm very struck by the fact that, you know, in Europe, where I come from, we still have infrastructure that was built by the Romans 2,000 years ago that lays out our street plans, lays out bridges, lays out roads. You know, when you build infrastructure, you're building for the very long term. If you're thinking about a power plant you build today, that power plant is going to operate for the next 30, 40 years. So the technology decisions you make today will determine your future, not just your future, but your children's future and your grandchildren's future. So it's very important that we take, when we're making public investment decisions, we really take climate change into consideration, because the fact is that the environment, the physical environment, the climate environment, the natural environment in which we're going to be operating 30 years from now, it's going to be very, very different from the environment we're operating in today. Similarly, I think markets, the way that the international markets operate is going to be very different as well, because we'll be using different technologies, different sources of energy. I'm here in Latin America, and I was just in Bolivia last week, and they're shifting their economy to move from thinking about gas as being the key driver to lithium being the key driver of the economy. And that's all related to the future markets that we're going to have for climate change. And that's we're thinking about that. You need to be thinking about that when we're doing our public investment management. So the key issues really are, you need to be thinking about how do you mitigate the physical and transition risks as they relate to the project. What physical and transition risks might make that project work badly or become what we call a stranded asset because it is no longer a viable technology in the environment we're going to be operating, and what physical and transitions risks we might create from that project. So let's say we're investing in a coal-powered power plant today. Well, in the long term, that's making you dependent on coal-powered power for the future for a long time, 20, 30 years down the road. Secondly, we need to be thinking about how do we align our resources with the climate change policy, thinking again in terms of, what's the role of the state? Let's minimize what the state is paying for and maximize what the private sector is going to pay for. And how do we mobilize that private sector capital? So, okay, the key elements as I see it are really, you need to have a planning strategy. Some countries have put in what they call infrastructure strategies. And I think they're really helpful because they lay out, what are the key projects that you're going to be financing and trying to develop over the longer term. That enables you to think a little bit about location. It enables you to think concretely about how you're going to measure networks. Because, when we're thinking about how changes in technology, that changes not just one project, it changes the whole network. So we're changing the way our transport network functions. We're going to change the way our energy network functions. In some countries, they're going to have to change the way that their water networks functions. Some other countries are going to have to change the way that their systems of agriculture are going to function. So you can't plan one project at a time. You have to think, what is the overall network in which our projects are going to operate? And think about how do we build those? So again, planning is really critical. I do think that we do need to be, as we're putting plans in place, I do think it's very important that we screen all our projects for what physical and transition risks they might be impacting. I think that covers all projects, from the little projects that might be a small bridge, small set of dams, a small set of schools, all of these things, all of these kinds of small projects could be impacted by climate change, both in terms of physical and the transition risks. And I think you need to be doing some screening of all of these risks, and putting a basic screening process in place. For the bigger projects, the high impact projects that are really of regional or national scope, I think you need to be thinking about much more sophisticated appraisal that takes into account not just climate policy, but also starts thinking about different kinds of scenarios for the physical risks, and also different scenarios for technology change and transition risks. Obviously, there are going to be a very limited number of these projects that you're doing every year, but it's worth focusing attention on these because they'll probably have the biggest impact and be big drivers for the way that your economy changes in the future. A lot of us are working with PPPs, public-private partnerships. I think they're a fantastic way of getting private capital to do infrastructure. We do need to be very conscious of the fact that the risks related to transition, both physical and transition risks, need to be embedded in those contracts. If you leave physical and transition risks out of the contract, it'll end up as the government paying the bill and assuming all the risks. And we've learned through hard experience how good the private sector is at shifting risks onto the public sector and making the public sector pay and allowing the private sector to make its profit. So I think if you're getting into PPPs, you need to have a very explicit assessment of what the risk assignment is going to be and embed that into the contract. The last point on this slide relates to assets. It goes back to this whole point that, when you're talking about climate change, we're not talking about individual projects anymore. We're talking about the whole network and how that network works together. And that means we need to think about not just the flow of new projects, we need to think about all those projects that we've already developed and everything all the network of infrastructure that we built. And that's about asset management. And frankly, looking around the world, I'm always astonished at how bad we are in ministries of finance at managing our assets. Many countries, I work with countries in the Caribbean at the moment, and they're attacked, they suffer regular hurricanes, which are devastating, yet they don't have basic asset registries. And I think that's an essential tool. You need to know what assets do you have, what are they valued? Should you think, then you need to be thinking, well, should I be insuring those assets? Should I not insure the assets? You need to think about what risks they might have. You need to identify those assets, infrastructure assets that are network critical. Those, for example, the hospitals, the bridges, the roads, the power plants that are critical to the rest of the network functioning, that whatever happens, you need to make sure those assets keep working. And those require a different level of protection from physical risks than the rest of the network. And you really need to be able to identify those. So moving on to public financial management, which is the area which all of us, I'm sure, are most familiar with and most comfortable with. I think here, I can't remember, one of you mentioned as you were doing your presentations of the results of the table that, the budgeting process, ministries of finance tend to have a very short-term perspective. We're so busy dealing with the budget every year that it's very difficult to look beyond that. And I think we tend to sort of push everything back into that budget process. Budget is important. I think the budget is a way of translating those different tools that we have. So the plans, the public investment strategy, the budget is the tool that we use to translate those things into real things happening on the ground. We do in the budget process, we do need to think about how we manage the risks, to fiscal risks for the budget year. We do using the budget to align the resources with our climate change policy objectives. To me, one of the basic tools that we need to think about is fiscal risks statements. I tried to look on quite a few of your websites to see how many of you actually have fiscal risk statements, and I found it actually quite difficult to identify. Fiscal risk statements should basically say, well, this is our budget projections, both on revenue, on an expenditure, and these are the various events that might cause our budget to deviate from the plan. And I think those need to include some physical risk and possibly some transition risk assessment. And you need to explicitly identify how you're going to retain, which risks you're going to invest to reduce, which ones you're going to retain in government, which risks you're going to transfer through insurance. You need to have a strategy. Now, you're very fortunate in the countries you're working on. You don't have a lot of very high impact, countrywide impact extreme events. But I think it's important to have a kind of fiscal risk strategy that identifies what risks there are, identifies the scale of those risks, and how you're going to manage them. It's also a good way of getting your various government agencies to start thinking about how they manage those risks effectively. Before we get into tagging, which I think is the tool that everybody's moving towards, I think it's important to have a good understanding of what your policies are and what their alignment, how your actual spending is aligned with those policies. What are the impacts you're having on the program on climate change? What is the most efficient means of achieving your policy objectives? So periodically, a spending review is a very powerful tool for making you think. You know, my experience of working on the budget process is it's so crazy and busy, you really don't get a lot of time to think about, well, strategy issues. And I think taking a step back through a spending review, particularly when you're doing it during the quiet periods of the year, enables you to think through, well, you know, what are we doing in the longer term? How aligned are we with our policy objectives? What's the impact of these various programs? Are we being efficient in the way we're using public spending? The basic tool for doing a strong budget is having a program budget structure. I know that many of you have already put them in place. Program budget structure lays out what you're trying, aligns resource allocations with objectives, and usually has some kind of objective set of impact targets. That enables you to think in terms of, well, what are you trying to achieve? When it comes to doing budget tagging, it's very, very difficult to do tagging if you don't have a program budget structure already in place. You know, I've seen some countries trying to do it. I mean, we just did this in the Bahamas with an administrative budget structure. And frankly, it was very difficult to get any sense out of it because you don't really understand what the institution as a big block is actually trying to achieve. If you do have an administrative budget structure, it's probably best that you just focus on your investment budget, because, you know, until you can actually think about a broader restructuring of your budget process. It's important to include guidance in your budget documentation. I know Philippines has been fantastic at this. I think the first budget guidance on climate change came out, as I recall, it must have been 2012. That's a decade ago. Very explicit guidance about how the Ministry of Finance wanted government agencies to integrate climate change into their budget process. And then we need to think about financial reporting. You know, it's not, if we're going to focus on climate change in our budget, we need to think about how do we integrate it into our budget reporting framework. And I think there again, it's important to think, well, you know, where are the contingent liabilities that we're creating through our work on climate change? What are the potential impaired assets that there are? Again, this feeds back into the risk management process. Tagging, everybody's doing, I think nearly everybody's either doing it or thinking about doing it. I think it is a very powerful tool for getting people in agencies to think about what their climate change alignment is. I see some tendency in some countries to try and get a climate spend, try and add up the amount of money you're getting through you're spending on climate change and saying, well, we're spending 7% of the budget on climate change. I would say that's probably the least important information you get through climate budget tagging. I think the most important information is a good understanding that you get for the Ministry of Finance and for the line agencies to get a good understanding of whether they're spending money on the right things. You know, is my budget actually achieving my objectives? Helping me achieve my objectives. I think that's much more powerful. There are a few cases where having a spend target makes sense. Now, as I recall, I don't know whether you're still doing it in the Philippines, there was a target that every ministry, every local government had to be spending 5% of its budget on disaster risk management. And, you know, the tagging made sense in that context because you were actually checking compliance with that statutory mandate. In the European Union, they've said that 35% of structural funds must be assigned to climate change. Well, if you set a target for a spend, you need to monitor it, you need to tag your budgets so that you can actually verify that you're actually achieving that target. So that's very important. Last point on the slide is about sovereign green bonds. I know that many of you are thinking of them. I know Indonesia has been led the world on this. I mean, they did their green sukuk, I think it was 2017. Fantastic. One of the first green sovereign bonds, really with fantastic design. Many countries have followed that example. Great. Now, there's two ways of doing a sovereign bond. One bond is by doing an input-based bond. Now, that's the traditional way where you identify a set of programs that you're going or projects that you're going to finance with the proceeds of the bond. As far as I'm aware, I'd say most of the countries are doing that. Then the other way of doing it is you do a performance-based bond. Now, though the first two performance-based bonds were issued last year, one last year by Chile and one this year by Uruguay. And they're interesting because they enable you don't need to look at specific programs that you're supporting. You just look at the overall performance of your economy and how it's achieving certain climate change goals. So there's a whole set of work around the different ways of structuring the sovereign bond fight reissuing. I think that requires some quite specialized knowledge. I'll speed up a bit now. So another essential tool that we have is public spending. Governments are the main buyer in every economy. Every economy around the world, the biggest buyer of goods and services is the state. I think in global terms, it's estimated about 17% of the global economy is in public sector procurement. So as the state, you have incredible power to shape your markets. You can determine which goods, you can give preference to local products, you can give preference to certain technologies, you can give preference to certain types of suppliers, such as small and medium enterprises or enterprises run by women or vulnerable groups. You can use public spending to shape your economy. Basic tools for that are around, how do you set up your compliance criteria, your environmental criteria? There's a tendency I've seen with the environmental criteria to make them very complicated. I think, simple criteria that focus on possibly biodiversity and climate change as the key criteria are most powerful and easiest to use. There are an awful lot of labeling that goes on. I know that mainly in the big economies, I know Korea has a fantastic labeling system that's worked spectacularly well. I know that Thailand has a labeling system as well that works for so they guide not just the public sector, but also the private sector in how to buy green. These are very powerful tools. I would encourage countries to think about whether this is something they should be using as well. For big purchases, things like durables, including some consumables, I think it's quite helpful to think in terms of life cycle costing. So if I buy if I'm buying electric light bulbs, should I be buying the old style light bulbs that need to be replaced every 6 months and use an awful lot of electricity, or should I be shifting over to more expensive LEDs? So, including environmental criteria and using sort of life cycle costing is a very powerful way to shift the way that you're purchasing to achieve your climate change objectives. You can use procurement. There are different procurement approaches, catalogs. As I recall, Korea, I think I saw a good catalog system in Thailand as well. I think these catalog systems are a good way of actually consolidating purchasing and making it easier for government agencies to buy green. You can use framework contracts, joint procurement. These are sort of very powerful tools to actually make it easier for government agencies to buy green rather than buying products that will have a detrimental or not aligned with your climate policy. And then you need to think a little bit about how you monitor and report on this. You can use pricing. In some countries are doing that. I know that Japan, when they started, they were quite willing to use price preferences to allow to support the introduction of electric vehicles through the private sector. And there's a good case study of how Nissan introduced the Leaf, one of the very first electric cars, mainly because the Japanese government was allowing electric cars to be priced at a very high level and quite willing to accept that pricing differential. And then I think there's a little bit as well is, if you're trying to green your economy, you need to think a little bit about, well, what market development activities do we have to support development of a green economy? I saw that, one of the proposals, I think it was Thailand, it was mentioning that they were going to be bringing in legislation around electrification of vehicles. Well, obviously, if you're building electrifying vehicles, it may be that you want to think a little bit about, what industrial policy you're having to support that transition. I won't go. I saw that you had a presentation from Jorge Martinez, so I won't go into the subnational in a lot of detail, but just to say that, subnationals are important actors. In many countries, your subnational governments may be climate champions. I know some mayors are really proactive in trying to build capacity around climate change, to green their cities, and I think that's very important to give space for local initiative. There are also mayors and local governments that will just sit back and wait for central government to do their job for them. And I think an important part of climate policy is putting in place the right institutional framework that sort of drives climate action at the subnational action level. So the key elements for me for this are around the functional mandates. If it's not clear what central government and local government is supposed to do, local government may not do it. So make it clear if there are climate change responsibilities for local governments, make them absolutely explicit. Are they responsible for territorial planning? Are they responsible for disaster risk management? Are they responsible for the electrification of transport? Are they responsible for water management? Having absolute clarity about what the responsibilities of central and local government is really helps implement policy. Again, planning is critical. If you don't have local governments, don't have plans, they don't have risk maps, they don't have land use plans. It's very difficult for them to engage effectively on climate action. I think you need to put in place coordination arrangements. I'm absolutely astonished as I go around the world how appalling the coordination between central and local governments often is. Very often local governments are rarely spoken to by central government agencies, and they're not really involved in national level policies. I think that that's as true for federations as it is for unitary states. And I think one of the things that we could be doing a little bit around the climate agenda is seeing how, as ministries of finance, given that you're handing these local governments a lot of money through your transfer systems, bringing these agencies together to get them to talk about what they're supposed to be doing and to promote climate action at the local level. On the transfer mechanisms themselves, I'm sure Jorge spoke about it, but I'll just quickly mention you have two options. You either go for the block grant method or you go for the conditional transfer method. Now, in Brazil, in India, the major transfers are done as block grants. And what's happened, they've tried to integrate climate change into the block grant system. Now, the attractiveness of that is that you're talking about a lot of money. Sometimes 50% of the revenues of the subnational governments in a single equalization transfer. The problem is if you start integrating climate change into that, you start messing around with the equalization function. An easier and probably the cleanest way to get subnational governments to work on climate action is by using conditional transfers, saying, well, I'll transfer you money to work on climate action, but you've got to tell me what climate actions you're going to be financing. Are you financing activities that are reforestation or forest protection or water management or electrification? So you have a single conditional transfer that you make, but you condition the application of those funds on climate change. That way you're really driving the subnational governments to undertake the climate actions. And then, obviously, I heard one of the teams mentioning that there was issues around getting reporting from subnational government. That's a common problem in the richest countries to those countries with the strongest institutional frameworks to those with the weakest. And I think we do need to be doing some work around, well, how do we set up these reporting systems so that they're not overly burdensome for some national governments, but they give national governments the information they need, particularly when it comes to actually supporting the conditional transfer regime. And I think you'll be relieved to know this is the last slide. It's about state-owned enterprises. If you look around the world, state-owned enterprises are the major drivers of the sectors that are heavy carbon emissions. So energy companies, transport companies, mining companies, in many cases, water management companies. These are all tend to be state-owned enterprises around the world. Now, the state, as state-owned enterprises, they serve both a market and a public policy function. And the state is a shareholder. It is the shareholder, major shareholder in all of these companies. Now, the state has incredible power as the shareholder to drive these companies so that they align with their national climate change policies. There is a standard framework that's been developed by our colleagues in the central banks. There's a network for greening the financial system that was set up by the central bank governors back in 2016, I think it was. And set up a separate group that was called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Now that sets up a framework for the way that central banks would like to see financial markets report and manage climate change. And there are four now. That framework is absolutely applicable to state-owned enterprises. And there are four elements to that. The first element is a governance framework for climate change. So the state-owned enterprises could be asked to put in place a committee or a management group within the state-owned enterprise that looks at climate change risks and opportunities. Secondly, the second element is having a risk management for a strategy. So state-owned enterprises can be asked to identify, assess, quantify, and report on climate change risks as they affect the business. So those would be both physical risks and transition risks. You could then ask the companies to set up metrics and targets that enable you to monitor whether they're achieving the climate change goals and whether they're achieving they're supporting climate change policy at a national level. And lastly, you would ask them to set up a strategy that deals specifically with climate change. So that would look at, how is climate change impacting on our business model? How is it going to impact on our financial plans? How is it going to affect on the strategy alignment? Now, this is very new. And I think it's something that we, in ministries of finance, I think there are many interests in terms of how we want our different state-owned enterprises to operate. But putting in place this framework enables us to raise the profile of climate change and inform decision-making. Maybe that state-owned enterprises won't change their business models, but at least it'll be made explicit, the basis on which those decisions are being made. So I think that's very, very helpful. I know that we've recently been applying this tool in a couple of state-owned enterprises in Costa Rica. Costa Rica has always been a country that sort of prided itself on its green label. So those state-owned enterprises, but it's surprising, even in a country that's very proud to be green, there's a lot of resistance from state-owned enterprises when they're asked to make their risks and metrics and have a strategy that's explicit on climate change. So it's been quite an interesting experience. So I'll stop there. I'll just penultimate slide. Do you want me to go on with the last penultimate slide, or shall I stop here?
Thanks, Adrian.
Are you
Perhaps
exhausted?
1 minute for the last slide. Is it okay?
1 minute for the last slide. Okay, 1 minute for the last slide. So you need to think a little bit about this. Goes beyond ministries of finance. It's about really, what the institutional arrangements you could be putting in place to actually support climate change in terms of creating incentives for governments to take action on climate change. So part of that is about, putting in place framework legislation. A lot of countries around the world are putting in framework legislation that sort of says whose job it is to do what on climate change. They can also set up structures for accountability. One of the tools that's really helpful is for you to set up independent expert advice, to have a set of people who are scientists, experts on climate change, who can advise on climate change policy. Then there are a whole series of governance structures you can put in place, like stakeholder engagement, oversight arrangements, access to information is important. So those sort of structures help you create an environment where you're informing the private sector and households about what's happening on climate change, what climate change policy is, and also getting feedback from these people, from by businesses and from the private and from households and communities about what climate change, how climate change impacts them, and how your policy should develop. And lastly, I mean, there's a slide here with some links. You know, back in 2018, we set up the banks that helped set up the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. We negotiated this Helsinki Principles, the 6 principles. Principle number 4 focuses on climate change planning, budgeting, public investment management, and procurement. There's an increasing body of material on that website. And if your countries are not members, I think some of you are not yet members of the coalition, I really encourage you to join, simply because it's good to have access to your colleagues. I mean, fantastic. You get to hear a lot about what other people are doing around the world. We have our own website where we have our materials. You're welcome to those. We have constantly more materials coming out. I think we need to learn. Next round of materials, I think, is going to be more about learning from you guys about the wonderful things that you're doing, and trying to sort of provide a forum where we can actually share that experience so other countries know what everybody else is doing. But thank you.